Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, there is an old joke about economists that goes, if you laid every economist in the world end to end, they still wouldn't come to a conclusion. I like that joke. Welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and ironically, there was a recent headline in the Charlotte Business Journal that read, "Why 5 Charlotte economists believe that 2014 might be the best year since the recession." That headline in itself may be an indicator and possibly to the contrary, just because they all agree. On this special 2-part year-end and New Year look-ahead installment of Carolina Business Review, we get it straight from 4 of our expert economists, the most critical issues affecting the Carolinas this time on CBR.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded December 13th, 2013. On this week's program, Dr. John Connaughton of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Dr. Frank Hefner of the College of Charleston, Dr. John Silvia of Wells Fargo, and Dr. Doug Woodward of the University of South Carolina. Now, here's Chris William.
Happy holidays. Welcome to our program. I noticed there wasn't any laughing behind me when I told that little
You don't want to line us up and down.
We couldn't make up our minds whether it was funny or not.
Stop it.
Well, some of us did.
Yeah.
Killing me here. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. You know what? I know I say this every year, but this really is one of my favorite programs. You all have been coming to do this program for, gosh, since the crust of the earth cooled. Right. So thank you for traveling, and thank you for doing this. And this guy right here was literally on the first program, right. October 1991. Wow. 23 years ago, John.
And he's called it right ever since then, right?
Yeah. I mean, let me say Happy New Year, and also let me say Happy Martin Luther King Day. And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, Doug, and you know your eyes raised, because we're on this jag now. We're kind of on this cycle, and it happened over the holidays, and it's happening in the political arena where we're forward-loading our cycles. In other words, they're running for president now in 2016, and over the holidays they started the Christmas sales and the cyber sales in October. John, let me start with you since you're way out there and you haven't said a word, uncharacteristically.
I have no idea what you're talking about. That's why
I know.
Well, here's the thing. And especially during the holidays, we are front-end loading our retail sales. It seems like we're front-end loading it. Is that a zero-sum game, or are we actually adding retail sales?
Well, it's probably a zero-sum game to some extent, but I think the reason this year you noticed it more was because Thanksgiving was so late in the year. It can't be any later than it was this particular year. This is the latest of Thanksgiving, and so it shortened the period between Thanksgiving and Christmas by a week. And I think that got retailers nervous, and that's why they tended to push everything ahead of Christmas. And you started to see some of this stuff come up, as soon as right after Halloween, because they knew they had to start before Thanksgiving.
I would say before Halloween. How did retail sales fare this year?
They're looking good. Yeah,
holding up really well.
Surprisingly good, as a matter of fact. And when we look at job numbers that have been created in the last year, at least in North Carolina, retail has been one of the success areas in terms of job creation in the last year.
Same with South Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Doug, you kind of headlined the Darla Moore School of Economic Report not too long ago now, and jobs were an important indicator for the Palmetto State. Where are they? Is that what led us out of the recession?
Oh yeah, we're in an expansion now. We're not even in a recovery. We're growing about 1.7, 1.8% year over year in terms of employment. It's the best that we've had since the recession. We think that it's more broad-based than it had been in any previous year since 2008. So across all sectors, regions, we're really seeing jobs come back.
Frank, John?
Well, can I add to the dismal side of that things here?
I'd be
my
disappointed
nature
if you did.
Is that just remind everyone that officially the recession ended in 2009. So we're coming up to our 5th year of what, recovery?
Expansion.
And, expansion. No one's
struggling to call it that.
Finally, now we are actually calling it
Yeah.
a recovery.
Yeah.
So, what has happened 9, 10, 11, and 12 has been just so stagnant in a lot of areas. But we're finally getting to where things are happening so we can call it a recovery. And it's also, as Doug pointed out, it is statewide. But we eclipsed in Charleston earlier this year. We got back to all the jobs from the previous high.
Yeah.
So we actually got there.
Yeah.
Not
I
all
would
areas
say, Chris,
can say that.
Yeah,
Right.
I would say, Chris, the conversation John and I had before we began the show, just the disparities between the different metropolitan areas is significant. North Carolina probably as well as South Carolina. I think when you're looking at, the Goldsboros, the Rocky Mounts, they're continuing to struggle. When you look at Raleigh, Charlotte, those areas continue to prosper. So it's a very different attitude when you're looking at different metropolitan areas, and part of that reflects a different economic base of the different regions.
Is the stark difference, though, John? Is the gap between the recovery in the rural and urban, is that gap bigger than it has been in the past?
Probably not, but the recession was so much worse that makes the gaps bigger anyway. But just to give you some numbers and some perspective on this, I think there's been this attitude. Frank talked about the fact, well, it's just starting to feel like a recovery, and I think that part of that has been psychological in the media. I'll give you an example. Last year, 2012, created 90,000 jobs in North Carolina. Best job year since 1999. Okay? Yes. It's the most jobs created in any single year since 1999. But yet people are walking around complaining that, Nationally, 2012 was the second best job creation year since 1999. We hear the talk, and when we listen to the presidential election, Mitt Romney kept talking about 3 million jobs a year, et cetera. If you go back for the last 2.5 decades, back to 1990, and you look at the annual job, we only made that 4 times, 3 million jobs. Okay, that's it. And as I say, last year with 2.1 and change million jobs nationally, that was the second best year since '98. This year we'll probably surpass that number nationally, probably pump out about 2.2 year. That'll be the second best job year since '98.
Just like that, those are private sector jobs.
And those
too.
are private sector jobs, yeah, because the governments are not, governments are actually negative.
Why isn't it, you were talking about South Carolina jobs and that they're very healthy. Why are North Carolina jobs lagging where they really need to be?
This year, we had the great job year last year. This year, for the first 9 months of the year, it looked like we weren't going to create any jobs. So far this year, through October, we've done 54,000 jobs. Most of those, over 2/3 of them, came in the last 2 months, basically September and October. If we keep that pace up for the next couple of months, adding about 15,000 jobs, we'll push 80,000 for this year. When you put those 2 years together, 90 last year, 80 this year, those aren't too bad. Those aren't 2 bad years. Those are 2 good years. It's hard to look back and find 2 years until you go way back into the end of the 90s when the economy was really go-go. And by the way, nationally, those 3 million job years, there's 3 in a row, 97, 98, 99, and you know what that did to the budget deficit. Those we actually didn't have when we had a surplus.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the target you look at, but that is so unusual. Is to 2 million jobs a year is a good number nationally.
And let me move upstream from this a little bit. A couple of weeks ago on this program, Robert Hill is the chairman and CEO of South Carolina Bank and Trust. And one of the questions we asked him was, if you make loans, are you going to create jobs? And his simple answer was yes. Is it that easy? If there is more credit extended, will jobs happen?
Well, more credit gets extended if some entrepreneur thinks that they can have better sales.
Right.
And they come to a bank like Wells Fargo and says, we want to borrow some money, and we look at their expected future sales and their management, and that's how it works. Simple as that. So yes, credit does create jobs in the sense that we're helping some entrepreneur who really is creating the jobs get it done.
And that's a big turnaround in 2013 now, where consumers are finally, their balance sheets are in so much better shape they can take on debt where they were paying down debt before, you know, up through 2012. And now I think we're getting to this point where consumers are starting to, you know, take on loans, which we need to have strong job creation, entrepreneurial activity. You know, it will get more into a virtuous cycle, I think.
Right, but I'll go back to the comment that John made about the banks, and that is there has to be a viable project. It's not just simply they're going to extend credit. And
What
that's
happened to the public
bullet.
works projects? What happened to all the shovel-ready projects? Would you
They're still shovel-ready, presumably, but the shovels haven't moved.
Why aren't those public dollars going to those projects?
First of all, the answer to
that
your
a
first
political
question
question?
about
Yes.
does credit create jobs, certainly Ben Bernanke believes that to be the case. He's been, you know, Mr. Quantitative Easing. The problem is that simply making money available doesn't necessarily mean it gets lent out.
Right.
As John mentioned, I think is really, really true. You've got to have that entrepreneur out there that has access to that cash, but there has to be that idea, that creativity, that risk-taking, and that's where we have the breakdown. Banks have access to plenty of money to loan out. They're sitting on over $2 trillion of excess reserves. I won't even try to explain to you how big that number is, but they're sitting on over $2 trillion in the system of excess reserves, which are obviously all available to be lent out. That number has actually been rising during all of this quantitative easing process the Fed's been undertaking.
You mean the cash on the sidelines has been rising?
Yes, absolutely, as the result of the Fed increasing their balance sheet with quantitative easing to the tune of $80 billion a month. The problem is that banks have become extremely risk averse. And so when they look at Mr. Entrepreneur A and Ms. Entrepreneur B, and they look at those systems, those people would have easily gotten loans in a much more tighter liquidity environment 5, 6, 7 years ago. But today, banks are very content with getting 25 basis points, 0.25%, on their excess reserve position at the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And so there's a real change, and we've talked about this in past programs, Chris, where I've mentioned the fact that the fundamental problem that occurred when the economy collapsed in 2008 was we lost the appetite for risk. And if we're going to push through this 2.5% meager growth rate, we're going to have to change culturally or our attitude towards risk. Banks, government, individuals, etc.
And I want to take a little deeper dive. If you're just joining us, you are watching end of the year review for 2013, and part 2 next week will concern ourselves with taking a look at 2014. Let's drill a little bit down in this whole idea of jobs. An economic developer, more than one, on this program, not on the air necessarily, have said that you know, this whole thing around jobs is that the Carolinas have a skills gap, and that is like Boeing, like BMW, like some of these higher tech manufacturers can't find the qualified workers. An economic developer said, yes, but there's also a perception outside of the Carolinas that the Carolinas don't have the talent. So who's right?
Well, I think if you're talking about the college-educated, computer-literate talent, I think we have a lot of that in this state.
That we have that inventory of worker? That
Yeah,
they're here
there
now?
are those people out there who can do the job in that level. And I think, no, I think that would be wrong to say that we have a skills gap in that area. I think mostly what I interpret the problem to be that is being said or expressed is there's the blue-collar manufacturing worker that is sort of missing. And the problem, I think, for all of us is when we go into a manufacturing facility nowadays, that blue-collar worker is operating a laptop, and the laptop's operating a robot. I mean, we have changed the character of the manufacturing worker in the United States much faster than the available supply of those workers. And so once again, it's a question of, you know, reorienting our education and our technical skills development. But I think that may be the shortage there. But overall, no, I don't think the Carolinas have a shortage.
Yeah.
I agree with that, and I'd just like to add, there was a New York Times article a few weeks ago about how BMW is starting apprenticeship programs. I think the other thing that manufacturers in particular, but businesses in general, need to do is help close that gap themselves. They're the ones that know exactly what kinds of skills, and they need to step up and start these programs, like apprenticeship programs they have in Germany, and we're getting some attention for doing that in South Carolina.
Let me springboard off of that. Boeing in the Low Country, you know, I'd say early on, this is a pretty big home run. It's a slam dunk success. BMW's done it because they're German, but what about Boeing? Has Boeing thought about this?
Well, yes, they have, and our local tech schools are getting involved in it, and we've got training programs specifically for that. It's not a surprise that Boeing located in Charleston either, for a lot of reasons. One of them is that we have a large manufacturing base there by tradition from the ex-Navy Yard. So we have a skill set. We have a population there that has had experience in manufacturing processes. Yes, the process has changed over the years, but we have people that are used to doing that. And you know, you take the average college student, for example, who's never even been on a factory line floor. They have no idea what the, you know, where this goes, what happens. And so that's what we need, is more people that have that kind of background and also a desire to go into those fields. You know, if you look at the media, for example, you'll never see anyone saying, I really want to become a tool and die maker. That's what I want to grow up to be. And so, and yet, that is an incredibly skilled, high-paying job.
Well,
Just
Go
real
ahead,
quickly
please.
to that,
Yeah.
you know where they're coming out of, Frank knows this, they come out of the military with some skills,
Yes.
and they can go and work for Boeing, because
Yes.
they've actually been trained
Right.
through the military. I think that's actually an avenue that a lot of people don't recognize works really well, especially in companies like that.
Do states like North Carolina, South Carolina, I'm sorry, let me back up and say this. Jack Sanders, the CEO at Sunoco, and he sat on this program, and he said, well, you know, we're a manufacturer, and we're being not punished, but we've got a headwind in a couple ways. First of all, we don't have any solid state industrial tax policy that leans in our direction, and it makes it hard.
Right, that's true.
The first thing, and then he said the other thing is the energy costs. Now, the energy costs are fairly low in the Carolinas, but I want to go to the state industrial tax policy. John, could it be better in North Carolina? Could it be meaningfully better?
Well, this year they did lower that tax rate, and we had been, North Carolina had
Corporate
been,
tax rate and
corporate
personal, right?
tax rate had been higher than any of our neighbors. But we can extend that even further. I mean, nationally, we have an absurdly high corporate tax rate, 35%. None of our first world competitors have tax rates that are that high. Some approach it, but not any of it. And I think that it would be, I think that we really need to think through this. Politically, it's very unpopular because there's this attitude about, you know, fat cats and corporations. But, you know, they are the ones that create jobs, and if you lower the tax rate here, you'll be more competitive with what are some of our natural competitors for new jobs and expansion of these companies. Remember, companies have become global companies. They're no longer American companies. They can make it anywhere, sell it anywhere. You've got to be competitive on a lot of different fronts. And right now, not just in North Carolina, but also nationally, from a corporate tax standpoint, we are not that competitive.
We have to also look at a lot of the other issues. Property taxes, for example, in South Carolina, we're not competitive on that area also. We actually are one of the few states that have our tax assessment ratios embedded in our Constitution. So it means a change to it is really hard. So instead we do Band-Aid approaches. So instead of figuring out what is a tax assessment ratio that works for all manufacturing, what we do is we target an industry. So an industry can ask for a fee in lieu of property tax, for example, break, and we'll give it to them because obviously we're not competitive at that rate. But the real issue is if we're not competitive at that rate, then let's look at the rate and let's think about this and make it uniform across the entire state.
Let me give you an example of that real quickly, what Frank's talking about, why it's really punitive, and this is why the against manufacturers, the CEO of Sunoco is absolutely right about manufacturing, especially is hurt. If you had an agricultural property, you know, you're paying an assessment ratio of 4%, much lower than manufacturers' 10.5%. So they come in and buy that property, put in all this capital equipment and everything, and raise the value of the economic activity taking place there, and they get hit with a huge tax bill that a retailer or a farmer wouldn't be paying. And that should change. We try to do it with a piecemeal approach.
Right.
Called the fee in lieu of property taxes, but then it's just all this negotiation takes place and it doesn't seem transparent. It seems like the easiest thing for them to fix. Why don't they just
change the ratios?
Change the ratios.
Well, isn't there some momentum in government reform in South Carolina? There's been a lot of talk about reforming.
Well, certainly.
There's been a lot of talk,
administration,
yes.
Yeah, not so easy to do.
You were going to say
Well, I
something?
was going to just reemphasize, I think the basic principle that John was talking about is that we compete on a global scale. And whenever you're in South Carolina, North Carolina, and you're doing whatever it is you do in the legislature, the realization is we compete globally. It's not competing one state against another, or your region, you're competing globally. And I think that is the essence of what we need to think about both at the federal and state level.
Boy, I can't believe you guys actually had a break in the action here. I mean, we can get something in here. We're going to talk about ACA in just a minute. Before I do that, I want to lob this out here. General Motors. General Motors was bailed out not long ago by the federal government to stop them from going through a Chapter 11 reorganization, or what we all call as a bankruptcy. Was that the right thing to do? Bailing them out, was it the right call?
I'll start. I might be the outlier here. I think it was. There might have been a better way to do it. I'm sure we'll hear how that could be. But this is what happened. You know, the auto industry is so important to our economy. It has the strongest ripple effects, you know, with the suppliers and the dealers and everything that was at stake there. Given, you know, that we had this financial crisis going on, I think that really could have been such a hard blow to the economy from which we wouldn't recover. We're a large integrated market. We need an auto sector. We want it to be headquartered here in the United States. It's going to be around for the rest of the century. So ultimately, I'd say yes, this was a good call.
I'm going to disagree slightly with Doug. I think that, first of all, on the positive side, in terms of the government should have helped a little bit. Car sales went from 17 million a year to about 8.5 million. You know, that's a 50% reduction through no fault of their own. And the biggest problem was that they lost access to money during that period of time, so it was very difficult to borrow. And GM in particular had gone through a period of time where they chewed up a lot of their cash, divesting themselves of some long-term contracts that they had with their unions. For unfunded liabilities that they had created over the years, and so it was a bad timing situation. Now, on the backside of this, what happened was the Obama administration went in and basically did a government bankruptcy deal. They didn't really bail them out. They did a government bankruptcy deal, and the intent of that was not so much to keep suppliers whole, but the intent of that was to keep the union entitlements whole, if you will. And that's what came out of that thing. So it didn't make the company really a lot stronger. It might have been better, and I know Mitt Romney suggested this and got all kinds of hell for it, but it probably would have been better for the company to engage in a more clean bankruptcy where all creditors were dealt with equally, as opposed to some were winners and some were devastating losers. And I think that probably would have been a better approach to it. The government just recently sold, as you know, their stock and lost a bundle.
Well, if the government lost, then taxpayers lost.
Taxpayers lost. Yeah. In comparison to what happened with the banks, which everybody is really angry about, but the banks paid back most of their money. I think there's only, what, John, about $1 billion left out of that?
Most of that small community bank.
Most of that small community bank of the TARP money. The banks, by and large, have paid back. They lost money on GM and Chrysler because the value of the stock they purchased went down. And Fannie and Freddie still haven't paid back. AIG's paid back more than Fannie and Freddie.
Yeah, right.
Well, the problem is, I think, you know, bankruptcy is not the end of the world. Bankruptcy is a reorganization.
Yeah.
And so basically what was chosen at the time was a government reorganization rather than a private reorganization.
You think that was a political decision?
I agree with John. I think it was specifically a voter's decision to get the vote for the union, yes. Yeah. I think you'll see the same thing in Detroit going on right now with the bankruptcy of Detroit as a city. It's going to be a vote-getting mechanism rather than a reasonable approach on how to deal with these issues. But what it does is it sends strong signals, and you've got to be careful about those strong signals. So, I mean, how do we interpret that for the next go-around? Because will there be another go-around? Well, of course. I mean, bankruptcies are going to happen. Okay?
You got about 30 seconds. You got?
No, anytime you do a reorganization, what are the incentives involved? Right. And have you restructured this so that now this company moving forward will be less sensitive to the next recession going forward? And that's the fundamental issue. There are always externalities, as you know was indicated, and you know, as Doug properly said, we don't know the extent of them, but okay, for the society as a whole, probably okay. But we need to restructure to really make the company efficient going forward.
Clearly, more to talk about on this one. Gentlemen, thanks for being on the program, as always. Thanks for the look back. We're going to, next week is a look forward on part 2 of 2014 with this same gang. And, you know, I'd like to thank each one of you. I know I did this at the front of the program, but thank you, gentlemen, for always supporting this program. And I'd like to thank the crew as well. And, you know, we don't do this enough. Donna Chavis, our senior producer. Randy, No Complaining Belk, is our director. Always a happy sort. Mark Boone, our content producer, done a lot of hard work in public policy. Cindy Sheehan, Rick Fitz, Michelle Cruz, Kevin Selger, Randy Fulp, Tom Green, Mike Smith, Jason Rowland, Tony Graham, Danny Boy Costin back there is a wonderful photographer as well. Jerry Thomas, Russ Hunsinger, I got it right, Russ. Kendall Bishop, who's been here and a silent member on that videotape machine. Alex Kaysen, thanks, Alex. And everyone else has worked on this program over the years. Jeannie Fry has been, and Rebecca, Rebecca Jones, you know, so many people have worked on this program and made it possible for 23 years. We'd like to thank them all personally. And thank you, too. Happy New Year to you. May your season truly have been merry and bright. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.